Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second Truth First conversation here at MacEwan University. It gives me great pleasure to moderate this conversation this afternoon with those of you that are here in attendance and those of you that are online. Thank you for your collective interest in this very important conversation. We'd like to start by inviting up Knowledge Keeper Daphne Alexis to come and provide us with an opening blessing and a song. As Daphne gets ready, I'd also like to invite our invited guests, the panel who are going to share with us their experiences this afternoon. So I invite Elaine Kidnasoe, Colleen Hale-Cardinal, Katrina Cooey, and Tom Snow. Please come up.
Abwashtit, Daphne Alexis McGavey. Wakamne Wahnimne Shidaha Himut. Pinimayad Nin Wahina Ogigipchin. Good day, my name is Daphne Alexis. I'm from the Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation, born and raised in Paul First Nation. I am humbly grateful to be here, to be a part of, do the opening blessing. I will use my Nakota language. The Chingebi, the prayer that I'm using, is what our ancestors left for us and preserved for us to use in times like this. And I feel like today's presentation is going to be healing, cleansing for a lot of us, and it's an honor to represent my ancestors, the language and the prayer song. Ishnish.
Thank you, Daphne, for that beautiful opening blessing and song, as well as for the smudge. Daphne is from Alexis First Nation here in Alberta and is currently the knowledge keeper at the Kahiawasistan Center here with MacEwan University. I now would like to introduce and invite up the president of MacEwan University, Annette Trimby, to come and share some welcoming remarks. Annette has been the president since 2020 with MacEwan, is Métis, and came from Winnipeg to now plant herself here in Edmonton. So welcome, Annette.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to MacEwan University. It's a beautiful, beautiful fall day here in Edmonton, and we are quite happy to be a downtown university in Edmonton's ward, O'Damon, which means heart through which the river runs, heart of the strawberry. We're kind of the heart of downtown. So I'm grateful to all of you for coming here. I know we have a large audience that is watching online, and I'm grateful to the people who are here in person for this important discussion on the impact of Pretendians on Indigenous communities. I'm looking forward to learning with you as we hear different stories and perspectives. I'm honored to welcome our guests, Knowledge Keeper Tom Snow, who's a little nervous about being way over on the edge of the room here, Colleen Hale Cardinal, Elaine Kiknosway, and Katrina Coe. Each and every one are exceptional leaders in their communities, and their voices will enrich the dialogue this afternoon. As a university president, I am particularly interested in hearing your thoughts on the role and responsibilities of universities, how we've contributed to the problem, and how to move forward better together. I hope this event is a catalyst for conversations in your communities, and addressing issues like this one take time. And I hope the wisdom and knowledge shared today will be an important step in your journey. So thank you for joining us, and again, I look forward to hearing from each and every one of you. I know in chatting with you beforehand that this can sometimes be quite challenging, and you might surprise one another in interesting ways, I don't know. Surprise is a weird term, but anyways, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much. And thank you, Daphne, always, and thank you, Shirley, for, I'm going to say, crossing the river to hang out with us today. Thanks.
Thank you for that warm welcome. This afternoon, I serve as your moderator for this dialogue. My name is Shirley Hunter, and I come from the Whitefish Lake First Nation, number 128, about 2 hours northeast of Edmonton. It gives me great pleasure to return back to MacEwan, again, to lift a very important conversation this afternoon. I would like to introduce our panel this afternoon. Knowledge Keeper Tom Snow, who's at the end to the left of me, is Lethka Nakota Stoney Assiniboine from the Stoney Indian Reserve in Morley, Alberta. He's been a facilitator of traditional Nakota teachings and ceremonies across Alberta, BC, and Montana. He managed a children's services business for 11 years, where he provided youth work, language instruction, transportation, and family reunification visits. He developed a wellness program for the Wesley First Nation to address addictions before working at Bent Arrow Traditional Healing Society, where he continued as an elder, leading ceremonies, circles, educating staff, reintroducing families to their own cultural practices, and teaching the Nakota Stoney Assiniboine language. He continues this work as the Knowledge Keeper at MacEwan University. Welcome, Tom. Katrina Coe, next to Tom, is a proud Dene Nitta Gewichin, a Cree mother of two, and a final year Bachelor of Arts students in anthropology and sociology here at MacEwan University. Born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and raised between Treaty 11 and Treaty 6 territories, Katrina is the daughter of two residential school survivors, an experience that continues to shape her path, purpose, and values she carries forward. Katrina's long-term vision is to support the reclamation of Indigenous governance systems through law, ceremony, and community. She plans to pursue the JID program at the University of Victoria to study both Canadian and Indigenous legal traditions. Her goal is to work alongside nations as they reclaim their systems of governance in ways that honor their histories, culture, and sovereignty. Everything Katrina does is grounded in love for her children, the strength of her ancestors, and the belief that healing and justice begin with truth and community. Welcome, Katrina. Elaine Kiknasue, a traditional helper, Swampy Cree, through her biological mother from Emisk and her biological father's side is from Buffalo Narrows, Saskatchewan. She is a member of the Peter Ballantine Cree Nation in northern Saskatchewan and is of Wolf Clan. She is a 60 Scoop survivor and returned home in 1996. She has been a long-time community advocate in the areas of child welfare, MMIW, 2SG, healthy families, and Indigenous wellness that include spaces for the LGBTQ2S+. Elaine is an Indigenous land-based focusing therapist, a trauma counselor, a blanket exercise facilitator, and trainer. Indigenous full spectrum, birth to death doula is also another one of her practices. A traditional dancer, singer, drummer, and is the co-founder of the 60 Scoop Network and a carrier of ceremonial teachings. Welcome, Elaine. Colleen Heel Cardinal is a Neheo Isquel, Plains Cree woman from Sad Lake Cree Nation. She is a community organizer, knowledge keeper, author, and kukum of 5 granddaughters. She brings over 25 years of experience in mental health, addictions, and crisis work, with a strong foundation in human rights, anti-oppression, and gender-based violence. Her work has focused on supporting both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and she has led the organization of the 6 national 60 Scoop gatherings in Ottawa. She is deeply committed to reconnecting herself and others to Indigenous knowledge through culture and ceremony. Welcome, Colleen. And I welcome everyone and thank you for joining us again for this important conversation. Today we are addressing the impacts of Pretendians, individuals who falsely claim Indigenous identity, and how this issue affects Indigenous communities across Canada. This is not simply about misrepresentation. It's about the erasure of true Indigenous voices, the loss of opportunities meant for Indigenous peoples, the harm done to culture, governance, and reconciliation efforts. Our panelists bring lived experiences, knowledge, and insight into the realities of how these false claims ripple through communities, institutions, and families. Together, we will explore the harms caused, but also the solutions, safeguards, and the path forward toward accountability and respect. I invite everyone here to listen deeply, reflect carefully, and consider how each of us has a role to play in ensuring that Indigenous identities are honored, protected, and respected. We had a wonderful opportunity to meet with one another before this panel, and we had some time to really understand our experiences in relation to Pretendians and its impacts and effects on community. I'm going to invite Elaine to speak first and to open this conversation for us this afternoon. Each member of the panel will have an opportunity to share their experiences and thoughts. We carefully put our minds and hearts together on the importance of this topic and how we might share their experiences with each of you this afternoon. So I invite Elaine to start with the dialogue.
Okay. Bonjour, Ani Tanse, Kwe Wachi Sego. Ile Indigenous, Maingan Dodum, Pelicaneers and Donjaba. I'm visiting my Treaty 6, so thank you for inviting me. I live in Algonquin territory. I was brought over there when I was 14 years old, so a majority of my life has been raised away. So when I come back, what they say to the 6, I'm really grateful, really, really grateful, because I know that there's more shedding and more learning to be absorbed. And this is my second time or third time here at MacEwan. Last time I was here was for a course I took. And I was asked to speak on this, back in the day, like in the 80s and 90s, we used to call them wannabes back in the day. And those were just that new learning of conversations of when people would give the impression to mimic us, but we knew that they were non-Indigenous. And I was raised by non-Indigenous, like I was supposed to be absorbed into the family community of church, of white. And when I say white, it's just because that's my experience. And if this conversation makes you nervous, ask yourself why. Why does that make me nervous? And if it makes you angry, ask yourself, why does it make you angry? It's okay for us to have the continued conversation, because that's how we were always supposed to be, in peace and friendship. In peace and friendship, we were always to be learning from one another, from the original source of the land, from the original being of the land. And, I've got many institutions behind me, from child welfare to TB sanatoriums, to residential school, to forced relocation, to on reserve, off reserve. For me, I was unstatused for several years prior to 1985. And then you became this new Indian called Bill C-31, back in the day. And those were the times of, when I was growing up in Saskatoon, like nobody wanted to be an Indian. And when I say Indian, it's because that's what they used to call us. Oh, there's that Indian girl over there, being raised in the suburbs by that Ukrainian mom and that British man. And that's my truth. And so the more that we uncover this place of truth and this descendant or generational conversation, because, this place of pretending has been here a really long time. And then you got famous ones like Grey Owl, right? And they were in Saskatoon and Prince Albert. They were in Ontario, right? Parks Canada is famous for hiring, and they're still doing it. They're still hiring Pretendians, and that's that place of, how come you're not vouching? How come you're not vetting? How come we're not having the larger conversation, right? Because it's not just isolated incidents. Now in modern technology times, there's now this call out or call in. I've been, asking a lot of questions for, 20 years, right? Like before we used to call them wannabes, and then we were like, but where are you from? Where are you really from, right? Because, I struggled with that, valid, because I didn't know all the paperwork to confirm where I was from, and then making the choice to go home, and then finding out I wasn't Plains Cree, so I nation shifted, and I'm like, oh, was I wannabe for Plains Cree for a while? Because that was the narration of the family. And then when I went home, my baby brothers were all like, don't you know you're Swampy Cree? You're Bush Cree, we're from the woods. And I was like, oh, I don't know, because I was raised down south. But I remember being raised in the bush. I remember prior to the apprehension. I remember those places of, sometimes they call it trauma and harm today. But that was just what they call childhood, an Indigenous specific childhood of that time. And when I speak, I don't mean to trigger or cause harm. It's really important to stay grounded while we're doing it. For me, I got like a little stone here, and I've got my little smudge thing here. Got my water, But when we're living, and Ontario is, I don't know, like there's a lot in Ontario. There's a lot being called out, like Joseph Boyden there was called out. And there's this murmur, these different conversations of, like, did you ask where they're from? Oh, but one day they said they were Cherokee, and then the next day they said they were another nation, and now they're Ojibwe, and oh wow, they're Algonquin now, holy, right? So there's this conversation of how the longevity that we are within community to each other, and we're at a a better place of being in each other's lives a longer time, because before it was childhood over there, separate, no conversation, grief here, missing, right? And then the return or not return, living in urban or going back to what they say the original land, or coming to school. So there was a lot of stop and goes. So when you're having the conversation of like, who's your grandma, who's your mom, right? Because that's an automatic. I'm Jean's girl. I'm Marie's granddaughter. I'm Roderick's granddaughter. I'm Ambrose's girl, right? And so it tells you where the land that I come from, and the trees and the skies where I come from, my lakes, Amisk Lake. I'm a little girl from over there, but I was raised over by the Ottawa River. I was raised in Algonquin territory, and we weren't always talking about even territories before. And so I'm unlearning my English. I'm unlearning how to be white, right? And there seems to be this conversation of like, this Indigenous knowledge, and now we go to schools to learn about how to be, or to learn about Indigenous knowledge, or to understand protocols. I didn't go to school to become white, but there was the absorption. I had to be absorbed. Take away my language, because I'm a language speaker, but I'm a silent one now. Take away my land, take away my community, take away my knowledge that I'm Jean's girl, right? And I have 13 siblings. So I'm really grateful that, when I went home, everyone was like, oh, don't you know you're related to them? Oh, don't you know? And that's conversation, don't you know? And I'm like, no, I don't. But I didn't also ask the questions, which leads into my own place of where I've been, I guess, led to believe that they were an Indian. Because I had really early learning training. You don't ask questions. Don't ask, don't tell, don't speak. I was really trained really well in these different environments. But now, in this place of, I'm all grown up now, I have every right to speak up. I have every right to tell my truth. I have every right to also acknowledge, we're not the first ones. There's many amazing reports out there now, because this is the larger conversation. And, we were at CBC yesterday, and that conversation of, the outing of newspaper reporters now doing it, and the big one of Buffy there, right? And that place, like, she and I were like in it for a minute, like, that can't be, like, I liked her music. And she was like, I didn't like the music, But I was like, but it can't be, because a part of you, my childhood, my teenagehood, my mini adulting and my adulting suddenly got stripped away. And so I was like, fine, I'm not listening to their music, and I took them all off my music thingies, because that was an action I could do. One of the actions of taking it further. What are you going to do about it? Right? And being led to believe, and having the larger conversation of, asking other organizations, like, how come you don't ask? Like there's different protocols in our territories and communities, and going to each other. Like I might not know everyone directly up here, but we've spent a little bit of time. And then there's other namesakes coming out, other relationships coming out, generational schools coming out, generational maybe even foster homes coming out, generational TB sanatoriums coming out, because that was the goal. Don't believe an Indian. That's the bigger goal. So when we speak up, it's saying, how come there's a problem? They're having a problem with that person, and I like them. I have a relationship with them, and you're challenging who they are, and suddenly you're the angry Indian, or you're the angry Indian woman. Don't be an angry Indian woman, right? But I'm like, I will now take my accountability and just say, I'm not an association. So people will say, hey, do you know them? And I'm like, nope, I don't know them. I knew of them of a long time ago. But back then they weren't an Indian, right? Back then they used to be French. Back then they used to be the access, and that's the other conversation where they access the services because we're free. That narration, if you're Indian and have organizations and they're self-identifying, then they are free. So that concept again, that narration, Indian stuff is free. You can get counseling for free. You can get food for free. As opposed to the ones that are walking back in by saying, I know nothing. I don't know any protocol. And there's a questioning. How come you don't even know that? Like, we're hard on each other too. And sometimes even one or two little comments will take us away. I don't go there anymore. They don't get me. And that's the uniqueness of, separating from Indian residential school survivors to 60 scoop survivors to present day child welfare. Because there's a different generational of learning. So I always reassure myself, I have every right to speak up. I have every right to ask. I have every right to stand tall. And even when I'm feeling uncomfortable, because there was many opportunities of the past where it was really uncomfortable and I didn't like it, but I didn't say anything. Or I was told, you don't say anything, you don't tell. But I'm an adult today, and that place of now these systems of use, now they're using court systems called cease and desist, you don't talk about me. But if we went to court, you'd have to prove. Or utilizing the collective of, it's not just one. There's usually many collectives. And there's that valid reintroducing each other into the community that are advantaging on, I would say, vulnerable. And we're not vulnerable. We're just not aware sometimes of protocols or practices because we weren't shown. So it's that gentle, this is needing to be informed for each other. And you're right, it wasn't okay for back then. So we're going to make sure that there's no more harm because it's so harmful. It even guides us away from our own ceremonies or even questions our practice. And that part is heartbreaking because we're losing each other. That place of I don't belong there, and the place of that historic place of, well, I don't belong there, or I'm making a choice, or I'm building a boundary, or I'm not in association with back then. So who am I related to now? And whenever I go home, I'm finding constant new relations. This place called This Phone on Facebook, the old school communication. I loved it because I was recognized even just by a thumbs up. And then they started doing hearts by my siblings and my relatives and my auntie. My auntie saying, "I love you, baby Jean." because I grew up to look exactly like my mom. And that I take ownership, because that's a place of community, kinship, family, to say, I love you so publicly. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that that could happen when I grew up. And I was just sharing in that little office there, you know, I used to pray when I was about 7 years old in this English home. And I was like, when I grow up, I'm going to have the most Indian name ever. And so I married a Kiknosway. So I stripped the English. I stripped the English because I'm still always going to be a Cree girl from the bush. But I always remember, you know, there's different places where we're still needing the breakthrough over the conversations. We have to be uncomfortable. We have to call out the human resources. We have to call out the policies and procedures. And your young minds are going to help us with that, because there's different generations that sometimes still feel a little stuck. That makes me uncomfortable. I don't know if I can say that. That's what I was saying to this beautiful lady here beside me. You got a better brain than I do. They're still learning. You can still see it in 5D, 6D, 7D. You know, like that larger. The larger picture behind it and in front of it, above it, below it, and into the center. Whereas me, it's not all black and white, you know. But I'm growing. I'm willing to ask, who are you? Where are you from? I got 1 minute. So I want to thank you so much. And I really want to thank this panel. I want to thank this land. I want to thank the elders. I want to thank my mom, because whenever I speak, I would tell her I won't ever talk hard about our life, because you had a hard life. And just showing up. Thank you for showing up. Miigwech, hi, hi.
We now invite Katrina to share her experiences and perspectives. Katrina?
Tansei Nitsika San Kahini Sekeheesquo. My name is Katrina Kui. My Indian name in Cree is Wise Golden Eagle Woman. My name in Gwich'in is Utsinve, which is Wise Woman Grey Wings. I am from Inuvik, Northwest Territories originally. I was born in Winnipeg. My parents are actually, well, my dad is from around Norway House, Manitoba. I was born there and left pretty early. The reason why we were down south was because my grandmother was going to school actually at the University of Manitoba for dentistry. And so both of my parents had me pretty young, like I think they just turned 16. So at that time, my dad was, he grew up in the child welfare system in Winnipeg. And so at that time, like my mom, I remember her telling me just the other day, I got off the phone with her because I told her, you know, like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can sit up here in front of a bunch of people and tell them my story. Like, so I had to call her and talk to her for quite a while. And, you know, she had to remind me of all the events that happened in her life so that I could be here. And so I just want to reflect on like where I come from a bit to start off. So yeah, I guess going on with my story, yeah, my parents were pretty young when they had me. So yeah, I left. My dad didn't want his name on my birth certificate. And so my mom was scared to even give birth to me in the Winnipeg hospital I was born in 95. Because of child apprehension. You didn't have to be involved with child welfare to be apprehended. not in the past, but still ongoing. I just really want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that the child welfare system today is a modern day residential school system. That's what I would like to acknowledge as well. But yeah, so going from Winnipeg to Inuvik, Northwest Territories, that's like the Western Arctic. It's right across the country. That's where my mother is from, and my grandmother. And yeah, so they went back, and my grandmother started to work up north in dentistry as a dentist. And so I grew up there half of my life, and moved around all over to the Yukon, through Alberta, yeah, just all over the Northwest Territories pretty much, until I came down here for school. So we left up north to come to school here, and that was the plan. That's about like 3,000 kilometers away from here. I remember being so devastated. Like, I was just devastated for years. I mean, like, it took me a long time to I felt so disconnected from my people. I just felt lost. I felt really lost. I felt a lot of shame growing up to be Indigenous. There was a lot of racism that was happening here in the city that I wasn't really used to. Because up north, it's a smaller town and more isolated. I find that if you're non-Indigenous, you're kind of you're outnumbered, right? So by Indigenous people. But yeah, so anyways, I've lived here since 2010, and I'm really fortunate to be here in Treaty 6. So where am I going with this? I guess, you know, the amount of like opportunities that are being taken away from Indigenous students within academia it's very heartbreaking for me, because, you know, I'm a single mom of 2. I just think about all the sacrifices that, you know, our parents, not even just our parents, but even as individual students, like, we have to leave our families behind. We have to leave our people behind, our mentors behind, our elders behind, you know, all these things. And it's hard to walk in 2 worlds. Like, the only way that I found my way was through Kehewatchiston, the Indigenous Center here at MacEwan. It took me years to even believe that I was even worthy of being in a space like this. But I was told all my life that you had to go to school. And that story stems back from generations. Like, my great Juju Elizabeth Vichurqua had told all of her grandchildren, go to school, just go to school. She knew, even though all her kids had went to residential school, she had lost 2 boys in residential school. And she was a matriarch. She raised all of her grandchildren, and they all listened to her. And they went to school. One of them being my grandma, who's a dentist, one of them being a social worker. You know, like my Juju Margaret, which is Elizabeth's daughter, was a teacher. Like, we just listened, and it was kind of, we took that very seriously, I think, throughout the generations. And I remember growing up and my grandmother, Doreen, just telling me, like, just keep going to school. And so, yeah, I guess, but with going to school and leaving your community comes a huge loss. Like, I'm still grieving. I still have imposter syndrome, where I feel like I just have to show up. I have to force myself to show up. And that's been my academic journey, like, throughout my undergraduate degree. I still shake, I still cry, I'm still angry. However, I think that I want people to know more in, like, a modern context of how, like, although we talk about the past has to be talked about to understand the present. It has to be. Without that, without truth and accountability, we can't have reconciliation. So every spot that is taken by Pretendians is a spot for Indigenous people. It's their inherent spot. It's their right to education, the inherent right to education. And I've worked in spaces. These spaces are not built for us. I've worked in spaces at a federal level, lobbying to the federal government. For a while there, I was in student advocacy. And I saw the systemic issues, the harms, racism actually, that are just so embedded into Canadian culture that it's almost invisible to people who are non-Indigenous. And I just think that I really tried to fit myself into these spaces so that other people could learn. My experience wasn't very good. It wasn't met with, let's be allies, let's do this together. I was actually so heartbroken, and I had to recover. I'm still recovering from that. It's taken me a long time from that position. So anyways, yeah, the access to the funding and these opportunities to say that you're Indigenous, I just think it's very heartbreaking because this is like money that's supposed to be for our people to have any access. Like, nobody understands the systemic underfunding from the federal government to our bands, that band funding, right? Like, sometimes it's not even enough money to make it, right? Like, a lot of our people are taking out student loans to cover the basics, including myself. As an Indigenous woman and a single mother, I'm about 60 grand in debt. And people want to say, oh, I wish I was Indigenous. I wish I was status. I wish I had free money. That's actually really, really wrong. And I just want to make sure that people understand that our money is inherently ours. Like, it's supposed to be for us, right? So that we can succeed. But yeah, so I guess, like, going with that, the solutions, I would say, is that we need to be in contact and in community with Indigenous people, whether that's institutions, organizations, like systems itself. I find that it has to be up to us to decide our nations, who is a part of our community. However, with that being said, systems like the Indian Act, which control who is Indian and who isn't Indian today, that harm is still ongoing. Like, I feel like the disconnection and the reconnecting Indigenous people are struggling. And to say that you're Indigenous without carrying that weight it's almost like I just don't know where your morals are at that point, because it's just these systems in place are not for Indigenous people. And we are continuously walking in two worlds. And it's very, very hard. It's very hard. And so now that I have raised both my kids, I have a longing to go home to the Northwest Territories. My home will always be my home, even though I'm forever grateful for being in Treaty 6 and to have my community here, and to have Kay-Watchiston, and to have, mentors and leaders and amazing matriarchs around me, and elders, knowledge keepers. I am so grateful for that. However, I still have a longing, and I believe my grandmother still has a longing to be home. And we have a longing for our culture, we have a longing for our language, and to be on our land. And the sacrifices that it takes to go to school, people will never see that. They will never see that, they will never understand that until we actually sit here and say, okay, we need you to listen to us. We need you to be our allies, whether that's sometimes walking beside us, behind us, or in front of us. My suggestion is to build reciprocal relationships as best as you can. Like, be in community, be vulnerable, show up as your authentic self. Like, at the end of the day, we're all human, right? Like, I mean, this is a part of what reconciliation is supposed to be, is that we walk alongside each other. And yeah, I think ending with that, I just want to say that I'm really grateful for you all here, whether that's in person or online. It really does mean a lot to me. And Masi Cho, hi hi.
We'll now invite Colleen to share her experiences and perspectives as well. And thank you thus far to both of you for sharing.
Ani dante, jawanang nodin kwe indishnika, sadalake and dojba, maing and dodam, nehiyas kwe and da. So, I am originally from here, Saddle Lake, Alberta. So good to be home on my homelands. But I was stolen as a child, as an infant, with my two older sisters, and taken to Ontario, to Anishinaabe territory, in a place called Bawating, which is the gathering at the rapids, otherwise known as Sault Ste. Marie. So, I'd like to thank my former speakers, and I'd like to thank the university for bringing us in and providing us with really great accommodations and food and great conversations. I want to shout out to my cousin Terry Cardinal, who recommended us to come and speak. Thank you very much. I wish you could be here. So, I've been up all day since about 5. We had a fire alarm at our hotel, so we all had to evacuate. So I'm writing my notes, and I'm thinking, what kind of message do I want to portray and to represent us as we travel all the way from Ontario, Ottawa. We live in Ottawa. I live in Algonquin territory, and the biggest message that I learned living in that territory is that I'm a guest, and that I have to follow the protocols and procedures of the people that live there, that I must consult with them and ask permission before I do anything. And that would be even me as a visitor here, as a learner. Even though I'm from here, I would still work with the people here. So I'm really impressed with the work that's been done here at the university. I'm sure there's more work that needs to be done. But to come back to Edmonton 10 years later, and to see, even 25 years later, to see so much growth, to see our language everywhere, to see representation is huge, because it wasn't here when I left in '98. So my two older sisters and I were solicited and trafficked through the child welfare policies. We were taken from our Treaty 6 to Ontario. Thousands of us were trafficked across Canada, the United States, and overseas through the 60 scoop policies. And I grew up in whiteness. I grew up with only white people in my extended family, all my cousins, my aunties, my uncles, because I was adopted into a white family. And living in almost like a silo, right? Where I did not see any other Indigenous people that looked like me. And I didn't even know myself that I was Indigenous. I thought I tanned really well in the summertime. And my school classmates told me I was brown because I ate brown bread. And I believed them. And I went home and demanded white bread because I didn't want to be brown. So growing up in a whiteness, and only seeing people who look like me on TV, like Ponch from Chips and Cher, and the typical stereotype Hollywood Indian, with the loincloth and the bow and arrow, and they're fierce and they're vicious. And, I grew up in a household that was racist towards Indigenous people. And people always ask me, why'd they adopt you? I'm like, that's a whole different panel. Anyways, so I grew up believing that being Indigenous, being Native, was a bad thing. We had 2 communities that surrounded Sault Ste. Marie, and every time we drove through those communities, my adoptive father would say, well, they live in shacks, and they're, all the stereotypical things, right? So that's in my head. That's what I believed. And it wasn't until I was about a teenager that my adoptive mother told me, you're an Indian. And I said to her, how come we never see Indians at the mall or anywhere else? And she goes, well, you're an Indian. And I'm like, what? I just could not believe that I was Indian. So I would say I spent half my life pretending to be white. I would dye my hair, dye my hair blonde. I wanted to look like the singer Roxette, because blonde, blue-eyed people were beautiful and they were acceptable. And people in my class and my schoolmates, they're all blonde and skinny and beautiful. Here I was, this very muscular, chubby, orange-haired Indian. Because if you're Indian and you try and dye your hair blonde, it turns orange. You would know that. Anyways, so I spent more than half of my life trying to be white. And it wasn't until, I returned to Edmonton when I was 16 years old, knew nothing about being Native, knew nothing about what happened to our people, my family. And I returned home to the shock of colonization. I returned home to my family who were living on the streets in survival mode. I had no context. There was nobody in the background saying, so this is what happened, and your parents went through residential school, and their children were stolen from them. Like, there was none of that. So all the stereotypes that I grew up with were reinforced, and that shame and that was already internalized. And only years and years and years later, in 2014, after my birth mother passed away, that I learned that she went to residential school. Because nobody talked about it back then. It was just like something you didn't talk about. And my relatives certainly didn't talk about it. Almost all of them have passed away since. And they should be here now. So returning to culture and ceremony has been painful for me. I can't speak for other 60 Scoop survivors, but for me personally, it's easier for me to to be white, because that's what I know. It's painful to come back and learn what happened to your family and feel like an imposter and try and go to ceremony and feel like you fit in, and it's a brainwashing and a deliberate brainwashing to be assimilated into white culture, and that's all you know. To come back to ceremony to your people where you don't feel like you fit in, we call it an imposter syndrome, where I feel like I'm not Indian enough, or they'll know that I was raised with white people, or they'll know. And it happens. It actually happens. They'll say to me, where are you from? Who's your Muslim? Who's your Kokam? And I'll tell them, they're like, oh, I didn't know they had kids. I'm like, oh, yikes. So I remember going to my first ceremony kind of at Sioux College, and I was afraid they were smoking pot when they were smudging. Nobody gave me any instructions. Nobody said anything to me. They were passing around the smudge, and they were all going like this. I didn't know what that was. There was nobody to teach me. So, I learned things the hard way. Painful, right? So what my point is 60 Scoop survivors, when we come back to when we come back to ceremony, we come back to our spaces where we belong, and we see Pretendians there taking up those spaces where we are supposed to be in positions of elders and knowledge keepers, giving teachings, and we find out later that they weren't even Indigenous. There's a betrayal and there's anger, and rightly so, because those spaces are meant to be for us. Some of the harms that, when you sit with 60 Scoop survivors, and we've sat with thousands, listening to their lived experiences of going through the child welfare system, what things were like growing up in an adoptive home, there's certain markers that you hear that are consistent in almost every story. It has a lot to do with loss of identity, imposter syndrome, racism is huge, because we're protected in that white home, but when we go out of that white home, we start being called these awful names or experiencing. I still get it. I still forget that I'm Indigenous sometimes, which is so weird. It's such a brainwash. And I wonder why people are treating me bad. And then I'm like, oh, yes, it's because I'm Indigenous. They're talking to me like this, or they're treating me like this because they're seeing my skin color. But what's happened and what we've heard from 60 Scoop survivors is they're so thirsty for culture that they will go to anybody to listen, who they think is a knowledge keeper, who they think is an elder, and they get hurt, whether it's psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, sexually. We've heard it financially. We've heard it all. And these are the ways that Pretendians harm our communities, by charging for ceremonies, by, exploiting them, or attaching to certain organizations. I don't know what it's like out here for that, but in the East, it's our school boards, it's our hospitals, it's our universities where we see Pretendians show up. And they take up these positions of authority, and once they're there, they're hard to get out because they're in positions of power and authority. But let's fast forward to the work we started doing in Ottawa. Elaine and I co-founded the 60 Scoop Network, and we recognized a need for 60 Scoop survivors to meet together, to learn, reconnect the ceremony in a safe environment. Cultural safety is huge for us, because we recognize that there's harms out there, not only for us reintegrating back into our spaces and where we belong, but also when we're bringing in people who are elders and knowledge keepers and vetting them and making sure they're aware of the differences between residential school and 60 Scoop, because there are differences, and how to work with us. So not only do we have to be inclusive in creating safe spaces, but also creating a space where there was no barriers or judgments of the lived experience. Because a lot of people are scared to come to the ceremony because they're afraid that we'll judge them because they've been in jail, or they did sex work, or they're still using drugs. We have a right, they have a right to be there, and we have to include them in our spaces. So creating safe spaces means asking tough questions and being uncomfortable. And sometimes being the bad guy. I'm always the bad guy. But I'd rather be the bad guy than letting things slide. So you get a feeling, and you have a gut feeling. And I had a gut feeling about Buffy, because I've had a gut feeling about her for a long time. Not that because I didn't like her music, but because her story didn't resonate with me. There was inconsistencies in it. And when you listen to stories of 60 Scoop adoptees and survivors, there are markers for everyone. We all have a shared experience. And those are the loss of the literally siloing us of being in whiteness. And that experience of being in those white families is unique. You won't get that anywhere else. It's not the same as being in a white university. You are literally siloed into that family and integrated into their religion, their worldview, their family, everything. If they're a racist family, you grew up racist. They're a homophobic family, you grew up homophobic. If they're, what was the one I was going to say? If they're Jewish, you grew up Jewish. If they're Mormon, you grew up Mormon. You take on all those thoughts, beliefs, and it's hard to unlearn. So that's one thing we share as 60 Scoop survivors, that experience of being assimilated. So being the bad guy means also creating some uncomfortableness, asking people, where are you from? Because that's how we get to know each other. And for some reason, the Pretendians who are being called out are using it against us and saying we're being laterally violent by asking them where they're from. But this is how we know each other. You can go to any community gathering here, any space where there's Indigenous people, and they will ask you, where are you from? Oh, do you know so-and-so? Or they'll know who your parents are, or who your cousins are, or are you related to this person? I meet people in Ottawa all the time who are from this territory. And they'll say, oh, you're from Saddle Lake, do you know so-and-so? Like, oh, I might know that person, or whatever. But it's the way we come to know each other. And now it's being used against us. And they're running to HR and they're saying, oh, they're being laterally violent. Or I feel like they're harassing me. And those things are being used against us, and it needs to stop. The only way that you can stop that is by creating a cultural competency policy in your organization, where your senior management and those in charge need to have some cultural competency of what our Indigenous worldview is. We don't want to turn them into Indigenous world, or we don't want them to adopt it. We want them to understand how we communicate and how we come to know each other. So the other thing that is important is to understanding and returning to community is, hold on, I just wanted to make sure I don't miss anything. As people even Elaine and I have, listened to thousands of 60 Scoop survivor stories, and like I said, you hear certain things. And we've had 6 national gatherings where we have thousands of applications that come in from survivors, and we look for certain markers, certain things that they share about their child welfare experience. And that's how we can tell if they're authentic, if they're genuine. And there are gray areas. I'm not saying it's cut and dry, but for the large amount of things, a large amount of facts, there's consistencies in stories. And the gut feeling, I always say trust your gut. If something doesn't feel right, to trust it. Because sometimes not trusting it can cause harm, right? So if you're listening to somebody's story and things don't make sense, listen to that, observe it, and hold on to it for a bit, because maybe you'll revisit that and be like, I kind of don't know how I feel about this elder. I should ask more questions to people that know him. The other one thing I just want to say, we don't have the luxury of making up historical, we don't have the luxury of making up mystical ancestors that may have some indigeneity or a smidge of DNA. We don't have that luxury because we're still surviving settler colonialism and have settlers trying to assume our identities. We need policies with consequences for fraud and identity theft. It'd be no different for anyone else who steals identity. It should be a criminal offense to steal identity and pretend to be something you're not. Being called out for a misrepresentation is not lateral violence. It is exactly what it is, an investigation into misrepresentation. So Pretendians who are listening, you need to do a moral inventory. I would rather you admit that you are a white settler and respect you for that than pretend to be me. Miigwech.
Thank you for that. And so far we're hearing just a lot of reoccurring themes and feelings of being pushed out and silenced, and it reminds me of the historical impacts around the silencing of our children in residential schools, and how that begins, and that being very cautious around stepping forward and stepping into difficult conversations because of the history we've had as Indigenous people in those institutions of being silenced and erased. We also, are starting to hear about really recognizing what are the safeguards and processes post-secondary institutions can lift and implement around those missed opportunities for Indigenous students in those institutions that are being taken up by those who are misrepresenting themselves. And we just heard about the importance of consistency and trusting your gut in the encounters that we are experiencing, and strongly, looking at pushing forward the creation of those consequences for fraud and identity theft, and in our organization, really seriously implementing those investigations for misrepresentation of your workforce. So really good dialogue, and I will now hand it over to Tom Snow to also now share and lift his experiences.
Clenete tanse garnin bonjour tanitara oki atitu. Yes, thanks for our introduction, Shirley, and I'm just honored to be here to be part of this panel on a topic that usually don't cover, but I should. I talk about historical trauma, and this would be part of it, for sure. So, and Bierna is manchaje tataga de mangyabuan. It's a naki ministni da. Shen umanji here nechi ya hedechi chatin de tibi hechi. Hetchen umanji here na den. That's a hamsa stone chohange. Winjaginin ohna himuka ohna mahyubika. Winji himam koka. That's all I do. That's all you winji himam says. And hamtasta chegiabzen and winji himam suan. Hetche I hogam. Ahangyas chibase hamahi ne chitnangaso wapewan. So I'm from the mountains west of Calgary. And I'm Nakota Sioux, also known as Miyahid Nakota, or Mountain Sioux, Northern Sioux, Assiniboine, Stony, and but we call ourselves Yiska Nakota, Yiska, and Nakota, Alpha Nakota. I grew up in the mountains. Like I feel privileged after hearing my panel of how I grew up. I grew up in the mountains with on horses, with hunting, fishing, trapping, camping, in the kinship, through rites of passage, all that, but not in the spiritual culture. Because, as most of you know, our cultural practices were banned in Canada from 1884 to 1951. But it's still in effect, even though it's been it's been rescinded for what, 75 years. It's still in effect, and we're still trying to find our way back. So I'm on my journey back. And in regards to the Pretendian, I was asked about it. So about my experience with it was. I kind of heard about it and all this, like that murmur that Eileen was talking about. And then all of a sudden, when Buffy St. Marie was outed, that hit me. Then all of a sudden, like it was a surprise, like there's all kinds of emotions associated with it. It was traumatic, like I felt betrayed, disrespected as a business person, disappointed. There was this sort of sense of false pride that had come out of her too, you know. And then it became anger. All that time that she was singing and trying to, and kind of chanting, you know, there was something off. You kind of felt there was something off, but you couldn't until somebody actually researched and found out and all this that the truth came out. We identified with her. She was singing these activist songs. She was singing all these songs that we associated with. And it was, as Indigenous people at the time, were being oppressed and racialized and all this that we're going through. And here she was. We didn't know the privilege of her she was either. We just went towards her. And even like when she was outed, there was a loss, but even to the questioning of your own identity in relation to her that you had grown up with, it was all confusing. She went around like with one of my relatives, Stony Park powwow singers. So I don't know how they felt. Like they were associated with you, went around with them, and she used them. Now that we found that out, she had used them. So now there's a lot of questions being asked. There's distrust, and to some point, there was when something like that is looked like that, they associate culture with her as well, even though it's a distorted culture. And then you're guilty and ashamed that you may have recommended her for something if somebody had approached you too. So it's really complicated. Huh? Guilty by association. And then later on, there are some books that were recommended to me, and one of them was Black Spruce, I think it was called. I read it, but I just couldn't connect with it. There was also The Inconvenient Indian. And there was so much talk about it, and it was always being recommended, but I didn't read it for a long time. I finally read it, and I was wondering what's the hype about. I couldn't really connect with it. And now I found out that they're Pretendians. And so that was kind of like in regards to that. Another experience that I had was kind of, it's not, I guess it's setting up for to be Pretendian. A friend of mine, a new friend, about 5-6 years ago, I made friends with this person, and then all of a sudden one day I got an email, can you be part of writing a letter of recommendation for my girlfriend? I said, so I thought, why? So we set up a meeting, and they told me that, and turns out this new girlfriend had been in Indigenous culture. She'd been raised in it, but she herself was not Indigenous. And she had come up here to Edmonton and became this guy's girlfriend. He was an Indigenous guy, my friend. And she wanted to do more. So she went through the avenues, and she had gone to the Fish and Wildlife to get some feathers or something. And she needed the recommendation of 3 Indigenous elders for her to get feathers. And she wanted me to be one of them. And I was surprised, so I started asking her some other stuff, and she told me something. And I was hedging on it. I wasn't going to do it. And at some point she says, "You're not going to deny me, are you?" And I thought that was real crazy. Obviously I didn't. But now I'm the bad guy, of course. Yeah, stuff like that happens. It's an awkward subject, it's an awkward situation. Girlfriends, love relationships, grandpas, granddaughters, all this comes about, and it kind of proceeds along, and nobody really wants to point it out until it's kind of has become really awkward, and you have to. So that's what we're dealing with. And you start this particular, you start to wonder, you want to ask, where's your morality? You know what you're asking me. I wanted to say that, but I didn't, because it's awkward. And, another thing that is, it's just look like an implied Indigenous person. Is another way of aspect of this is, I bought this artwork, It's real nice art. It was another Indian pony, I think it was called. And it's an indigenous person in 3 bars stealing a horse from soldiers. And at that time, I was just awakening, I guess you would say. So I bought it because I thought it was nice. And then later on, I was thinking, I looked at it again, then I looked at it, and then after a while, it kind of bothered me. So I looked at the artist, and it was Bev Doolittle. And then I looked at her biography, and it turns out she wasn't Indigenous. And that bothered me. So I sold the piece. But another aspect of this is I had assumed, I had kind of thought that she was, because of the art that she was doing, the images that she was putting out there, it looked like she was an Indigenous person doing this. And all this time, she wasn't. And I think that is happening all the time as well. It's sort of. So that's all that comes to mind at this time. So this panel, like it's about truth. Truth about people living in lies at the expense of qualified people. That's what I say. Ishnius, thanks for having me.
Thank you to each of the panel. You know, I'm sitting here and listening attentively to each of you, and one of the things that come up to mind are those markers, the markers that you talk about in the work that you're doing with the 60 Scoop survivors. And how might those markers be interpreted for, say, the university in recognizing the authenticity of those that are representing themselves as Indigenous? What might the university begin to do, you know, in understanding what some of those markers are? I'm wondering if Elaine or Colleen can share a little bit more about that.
Sure. So we are consultants for $500. Just kidding. No. So one of the things that is important is when you work with, when you're wanting to find out more, is to go to the survivors that have lived experience, that can talk about those experiences. So when we do our forums, or we're say we have a gathering coming up. We don't, but just say we do. I don't know why I said that. We would ask them, what was your child welfare experience? Did you experience foster care? Almost all of us have experienced foster care as adoptees, because we would go through the child welfare system, we'd go to a receiving home, and then we would eventually be adopted out. Some of us get re-adopted. We get taken back to our child welfare agency and get re-adopted because that adopted parent didn't want to raise you anymore or whatever. So part of that is asking them, what was your foster care experience? Do you want to share? Did you experience adoption? Where were you born? Where were you taken to? Where did you experience your displacement? Or were you displaced? That's the biggest one for us. So what we know as people who've experienced child welfare and displacement is thousands and thousands and thousands of us were taken from the West and brought to the East, not the other way around. You'll find people from Ontario that ended up out here, but usually because they wanted to, not because they were taken from Ontario and adopted into the Western provinces. At the time when the 60 Scoop happened, there was a need and a want to fill a void in Ontario. It was more settled. There was more people in Ontario than there was out west here. I would call it child trafficking, but I'm getting off topic. the experiences that these people share are, you could ask questions about when did you return to community? How did you return to community? Are you still wanting to return to community? Or do you need support in cultural reconnection? Those are ongoing supports that we would offer. Or do you want support in exploring your genealogy? Not your DNA to authenticate yourself, but your genealogy is more important than your DNA. Those are things that you can do. But to educate every level, from senior to medium to frontline staff, on what the actual 60 scoop is, because many people, we get conflated with residential school survivors and day schools, and the difference between the residential schools, of course, is location, right? So all the children were brought to these physical locations and experienced those losses together, as awful as they were. Whereas the 60 scoop literally, deliberately child trafficked us, solicited us through newspapers, television ads, and adopted us out to different cities and countries across the world. And the difference is that we were raised in silos within those white communities, where you are raised to be individualist and so on. That's the biggest difference. And that would show up somehow in an application when you're dealing with a 60 scoop survivor, because sometimes they don't understand that they were part of a larger experiment to assimilate us. They just know that they were adopted. So sometimes, you know, you might put right on the form, do you know about the 60 scoop? And if you don't, would you like to learn more? And that could be like a building block for them too, and how you can incorporate that into your knowledge center. Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
There's no one approach. There is no one, you know, do this to this to this, and it'll wipe out all pretendians. That's not how it works, because there's a lot of manipulation. There's a lot of gaslighting. There's a lot of bullying, like straight out bullying and harassing. And then you have the defendians too. Like there's usually somebody that's of our people saying, oh, they're great people, like they're my friends. And so it's that constant place of, well, now you've got the defendians who are bullying you in community because you were speaking up against this, and not against the person, but questioning, like, who are you? Where are you from? You know, like, the famous case is the Gill sisters, right? And they were pretending to be Inuk, and they charged the parent, right? So it could be like generational. You were told that that was my grandparent from generations before. And that's why that genealogy is so important, because you don't see anyone coming forward and saying, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I was led to believe generationally that I was Indigenous or Inuk or Métis. And for this, I'm going to pay back my student loan. I'm going to give that grant back to the organization. I'm going to give these awards back because they were for our people. Like that's that inherent rightful place where we're recognizing each other. But we also recognize, you know, in our communities, there's a lot of beautiful relations that have been built. And sometimes it's understanding. Sometimes you have to take a pause and really think it out. And there's a lot of reports out there that have been cropping up in the past 5 years out of Saskatchewan, out of Alberta, you know, and that's where the West is the lead, right? The lead. And it's okay to be the lead, because it's also that place of now there's actual action. And it's not just the action from human resources. Oh, they'll handle it, right? It's a community conversation.
Thank you for that. It's just a reminder of we have a ways to go in really landing at places where we truly understand how we address misrepresentation of identity in our communities and in our organizations. And I think just as a closing question, and then I'd like to wrap up with just a summary of our dialogue this afternoon, is this one to the panel. What can non-Indigenous allies, organizations, and institutions do to ensure accountability and prevent Pretendians from exploiting Indigenous identity moving forward? Who would like to take that question on? What can non-Indigenous allies, organizations, and institutions do to ensure accountability and prevent Pretendians from exploiting Indigenous identity? Thank you.
Everyone's just looking at me. I'm like, why? I'm just kidding. Why me? The chosen one. Just kidding. Well, that's a lengthy question, actually. It's such a complex answer, I think. It's really hard because reflecting on all of our, especially our women within relation to the Indian Act and non-status and being, actually outed from their communities. And I just think about that. That happened in my family. It happens all the time to my friends that are, who are my age, that they are fighting for their status. They're fighting for it so that they can be connected to their communities. And so I think that, within institutions, I think it's a little bit tricky because we don't want to, I guess, reinforce another settler colonial way of okay, who belongs and who doesn't belong, in a way that it's so kind of reinforcing the Indian Act, I guess, in a way. But however, with that being said, I don't think that we should be able to self-declare and just say that we're Indigenous. I don't think it should be that easy as a check mark on a piece of paper. To access the bursaries, to access the spaces that are meant for our people within either the academia or jobs, nonprofits, wherever it may be. It's interesting because I think my experience working within a nonprofit, I was actually, I think I knew for a fact that they were Pretendians. And they were hosting, this was actually out east when I was doing my advocacy work. And, it was interesting because coming from, Edmonton area, none of us we were on a committee of Indigenous students across Canada. And I think, it was just interesting. We were never consulted about who we would like, even though it was in our committee to actually say, hey, we would like someone to open or an elder to be there. And we were planning for all of us to decide, I'd like to bring my elder or my mentor or my cookum or whoever it is, to our meetings. And they just chose for us, the nonprofit. So it's there's no consultation at all. I think that people are scared to even consult or talk with Indigenous communities, and I don't really understand that part. So I really think it's just being in community. I think it's about showing up with vulnerability and humility, and just being in community for a bit, and just understanding, okay, how can we work together in the future or the near future on these policies? How do we start doing that? How to take a good look at your position and your privilege, because everyone has different privileges, right, within this society. And I think it's taking a hard look at that and really understanding where you stand within society and like how can you help and do better in this position? How can we get Indigenous people to these spaces that are meant for them? How do we do that safely? Like how do we for like just as human beings? Like I think it's about consulting community and being in community and creating policy that's rooted either in ceremony or just, collaboratively together. So, yeah, hi.
Thank you for that. And thank you to the panel. And truly, it's all about relationships and deepening those relationships and understanding one another. I had just the incredible opportunity to hearing each of your stories and your experiences and the reoccurring impacts coming through your voices around your experiences, around those who are performative in their identities as Indigenous peoples, again, extractive of knowledge, commodifying that knowledge as well. And, trademarking traditional teachings is also emerging in our communities and in a lot of the literature that's surfacing, not only in academy, but in community. And that I'm still grappling in my mind is how do we trademark the 4 directions? And again, it's constantly about taking up the resources and really importantly, our need to really understand where are these individuals who are claiming to be Indigenous and are not, because they are not showing up in our communities. They are not showing up at our wakes and our funerals. They're not showing up for us when we're fighting for our existence and our right to be on these lands. And so there is clearly a distinction there. Just from some of the emotion that came through your stories, those feelings of betrayal, feeling disrespected, the anger that continues to sit there, the false pride that's emerging, and you begin to question your own judgment of individuals. And I'm going to go back and really think a little bit more about Pretendians because I, in my mind, was starting to visualize what some of those folks look like in our community. And again, moving forward, the importance of opening spaces so we can create those policies and those processes in looking at and examining really clearly misrepresentation and the consequences to misrepresentation. I thank all of you for being here with us over the last couple hours. I thank those of you online who also stayed with us and listened to the stories of our panel this afternoon. I thank you again to our panelists for sharing your wisdom, your truths, and experiences with us today. The conversation around Pretendians is not only about individual actions, but about the broader impacts on Indigenous communities, the loss of opportunities, and the harm to cultural integrity, and the challenges this creates for true reconciliation. And we're moving towards the Truth and Reconciliation Day on the 30th. What we've heard today makes it clear that accountability must be paired with respect, and that institutions and organizations and individuals all share responsibility in protecting Indigenous identity. The solutions must come from Indigenous nations and communities themselves, supported by allies who are willing to stand beside them in truth. As we leave this discussion, I encourage each of us to reflect on our roles, to challenge false claims when we see them, to support Indigenous-led processes for verification and recognition, and to commit to actions that uphold dignity, sovereignty, and voices of Indigenous peoples. This is how we move forward, in honesty, in respect, and in the spirit of true reconciliation. And with that, I thank you all this afternoon. Ai hai, kinanas kumpnawa.